Hi, everyone, and welcome to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm your host, David Kelly, and today we're talking about something every L&D leader grapples with: how to scale learning effectively, not just scaling it widely, but scaling it wisely. And we're thrilled to be joined by Frank Nguyen, an award-winning learning leader who has built scalable learning strategies for Fortune 100 companies around the globe and has been recognized globally for his learning innovation. Frank, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sally. Appreciate the invite. Great to be here. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. So let's level set to start our conversation here. We're using this term scaling learning. When you say that, when you say scale learning, what do you actually mean? Is it reach? Is it consistency, performance outcomes? What does scale mean to you when you hear that term?
Yeah, it's a little bit of all those things, David, right? So, if you're working in a large Fortune company, it's likely that, your reachable audience, it could be thousands, could be hundreds of thousands. In my case, I've actually worked with a company that had 2 million people. So there's both, I think, scaling in terms of just sheer numbers of people. So that's kind of one aspect. Another aspect to think about scaling is also geographic reach, right? So I've worked for Fortune companies that were US only, retailers specifically that only had stores in US and Canada. I worked for a bank that really had customers worldwide, even though it was a US based bank, issued credit cards across the world. I've worked for another omni-channel company that had a global reach, 165 countries, right? So from both an employee perspective or maybe a customer's perspective, you start thinking about the typical things about translation, localization, but scaling also means technical reach, right? So, how can you get to your data, your content to that individual, all the way down the last mile? Because these days it's not just a laptop like what you and I are now, but it's a mobile device is also scaled. So there are a lot of complexities involved from both sheer numbers, global reach, content, sort of localization, personalization for that individual wherever they may be in their work. So yeah, it means a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different tactics that you can take as a learning leader to drive after that scale. It could be learning productization, it could be standardization. There are a lot of different levers you can pull, and I would say that some of the tactics I've used over the years are the same at different companies, and certain companies I've been at had to take a really drastically different approach in order to scale. Core of all those probably is, though, some form of digital learning strategy, and thinking about how and where do you use the technology to learn or deliver learning, and how and where do you best use people to deliver, learn, and coach, right? And I think you have to think about scaling with both of those together. It's not just one or the other, if that makes sense.
It does. But what would you, and based on your experience, what would you consider some of the core ingredients that make it scalable? Because you mentioned it goes digital. And sometimes when you take something that was originally in one space, like an in person environment, it can become diluted in the process of scaling it. How do you maximize the impact without diluting it?
Yeah, yeah. The I think the core of it, of every strategy I've ever had around scaling learning, is a product mentality. So there are different books from different Silicon Valley authors. I'm not just going to plug any of them, but you can learn more about product model from any of those folks. And so about 3 or 4 jobs back, I switched my mentality from a training services organization where I just put it plainly, we build workshops, we deliver them over and over. It's kind of a rinse and repeat process. Those types of training services don't scale. They scale linearly with the business. Meaning, for instance, if the organization grows 30% or if it doubles in size, you as a training organization, and I'll use training different from learning now, as a training organization also have to grow proportionally with that business in order to scale with it, right? What the product model allows you to do is think about building reusable, scalable, durable, transferable, standard learning products that could be digital, right? It could be a video podcast like this. It could be a 60-second micro learning that you post on something like a YouTube. It could be, especially in the world of AI right now, you could probably do a version of this podcast, with Gemini, right? Don't need us anymore, David. Unfortunately, that's not entirely true. Anyway, lots of ways to do digital learning where it is scalable because you build it once. It's a really high fidelity asset, and you could deliver 1,000 or 1,000,000 times, right? So that is part of the play. But the other part of the play with a product model is, when and where you do use human beings, which you have to have in a scalable model. what does that learning product look like? So if you can imagine, we build a experiential learning product where we take a group of employees who are field sales, and we take them through the standard field sales model, and we give them software tools that they'll use to manage accounts, right? So just kind of use that as an example. In the past, that workshop may only be as good as the person delivering it, but in a learning product model, you build such a robust asset that you could teach it, David, I could teach it, and I may know nothing about it, but the level of quality and the learning is exactly the same, right? So you're actually building the learning product in a way where you're divorcing the delivery of it from the person, right? And so if I think back to a company I worked at, we probably all purchased from them. They deliver boxes of smiles to your door. That was at its peak, 1.86 million people worldwide. And I pivoted my team the first year in the job from a services organization, training services, to learning products. And so we built learning products that we then gave to every warehouse. Say, hey, this is how you pack a box. This is how you teach someone to drive a forklift. This is how you teach someone to, load a trailer. Any transaction that you can imagine in an environment like that was taught exactly the same way, whether you were in a US warehouse, in a warehouse in Perth, Australia, whether you're in a warehouse in Singapore itself. So worldwide, it was the same product, but I didn't necessarily send someone to that site to deliver it. We gave that asset to someone on the ground so that they could deliver it locally, right? And so, again, for me, the core of every organization I've ever had around scaling is this idea of transitioning from a training services organization that scales proportionally to the business versus a learning product organization that scales disproportionately to the business. Like, you could actually scale yourself, 5 to 10x based off the fact that you build this really great high fidelity product that anybody can use, if that makes sense. So
It
I'll stop,
does.
David, if that jives with you.
No, that's great. Absolutely. So I want to before we move on to the next topic, I want to touch one other thing that you on the language that you use, because I sometimes feel that this is mixed. When you were talking about the global space, you mentioned the fact that you need to translate it for the local audience, you need to localize it for the local audience. And I've noticed in our industry that sometimes those two terms are used interchangeably as if they're the same thing. And localization is more than just the translation. Can
100%.
you speak a little bit to that about like what's involved in localization beyond just the translation piece of
Yeah, I mean, translation, especially these days, is the easiest part, right? Like, I traveled the other month to Budapest for the first time. Beautiful country. It's the first time I've ever encountered in my life where the core language set was something I could not figure out. Like most places I go, like I know French, I know Vietnamese. So a lot of times if I go to Italy or one of those countries, I don't know the specific language, but I can figure out things in context. And so I went to Hungary and couldn't figure out a thing. Like, I went to buy something at the local grocery store, and just the checkout, the screen I couldn't read. So I pulled out my Google phone, turned on Translate, and did the translation. I could survive in that situation. Localization, to your point, I mean, it includes translation. It could include translation as part of it, language translation, which is the easy part. The harder part, though, is culture, local laws. It's, I mean, sometimes even down to things like colors, right? I was in this cash register in Budapest, and it gave me a little red signal, which to you and I would have said I did something wrong. And I just swiping my card, and the lady said, "Hey, you're good." Like, and in our world that would be green, right? And so even subtle things like that, colors can make a big difference. To kind of replay, kind of maybe actuals. So at one point, I owned onboarding for a worldwide company for every associate, early associate, all the way up to leaders in those buildings. And what we'd often do is build a core global learning product. So here's what it means to be part of this culture. Here are the things we value. That was maybe the 80% of onboarding. And we left enough room for 20% localization by those sites, right? So, like, if I think about Saudi Arabia, was one of the sites where we delivered onboarding to, and so they would add sort of a Saudization component to that. And so a lot of times I think about what we do as building vanilla ice cream cones. That then at a local site, your localization is adding sort of those sprinkles to the ice cream cone to make it contextually, more relevant to those individuals. So anyway, that's another way to think about the localization piece. As you can still do a core learning product model to that, knowing that you're giving room for people to add liberties in terms of just local content. And it could be laws, it could be customs, it could be, you know, a cultural component that sits there locally at that site that's not at the global level, if that makes sense.
It does, and that gives us a good foundation around what we're talking about when we use the word scalability. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into some of the systems, the structures, and strategies that can support learning at scale.
Let's be honest. Virtual learning isn't new, but doing it well, at scale, and across teams, that's a whole different story. Most organizations think the secret is better platforms or flashier slides, but the real game changer is having someone who can elevate everyone else. Today's L&D landscape demands more than great facilitators and engaging content. It demands leaders, people who can coach, mentor, and ensure that every virtual session lives up to its promise. And without that leadership layer, even the best content falls flat. Sessions feel inconsistent, teams hit a ceiling, and growth, it stalls. And that's where the virtual learning coach steps in. This designation fills the critical gap between designing and developing training and leading a high-performing virtual learning organization. As a certified virtual learning coach, you become the multiplier. You're not just supporting great sessions, you're shaping great learning cultures. You'll gain practical coaching frameworks, actionable feedback tools, and the confidence to mentor facilitators, producers, and instructional designers. And the best part? You'll be the reason others level up. You'll see your team grow. You'll watch their sessions improve. And you know that you will have a hand in making it happen. That's leadership with impact. And it feels amazing. InSync Training created this designation because we've lived it. For over 20 years, we've led the way in virtual facilitation, design, and production. Our people-to-people approach grounds everything we do in real connection, purposeful feedback, and intentional growth. And this isn't just theory. It's what we've used to build high-performing teams around the globe. And now we're handing that playbook to you. So if you're ready to stop just running sessions and start leading a movement, become a certified virtual learning coach. Choose your path, earn your badge, and most importantly, become the person who helps others thrive in the virtual learning space. Let's raise the standard together.
Welcome back. So now we're going to go into the system structures and strategy around scaling. Now, Frank, you've talked about linking strategy, governance, technology, and measurement. What does that ecosystem need to include to truly support scaling your learning program?
So there's the typical things that we think about in the learning years. Learning experience platforms have been around for a little less time, maybe let's say 10, 15. Those are probably like the core technical systems. In terms of really scaling, again, some of it is dependent on which industry you're in and where you're working. So for instance, let's say you're more tech oriented. I think a workflow learning system of some kind, digital adoption system, they come with a lot of different names, but think about how do you get content into the work at the moment of need. It is really those types of systems in a tech world. If you are in a manufacturing environment, that looks radically different, right? People aren't generally at workstations all day long. They are interacting with widgets. So you have to think about how do I actually get learning integrated into that work? It could be through handheld RFID guns. It could be through tablets that people are using to interface with. It could be the actual equipment itself, right? So if you're in an environment where you've got hardware, lithograph machines, diagnostic machines, whatever they may be, most of those things these days are basically computers attached to gigantic pieces of hardware. So in order to think about scaling, it is both the traditional learning management systems, LXPs, LRSs that we're used to thinking about. But usually what I try to do is figure out where do people spend most of their time working? How can I bring learning to that work? And then partnering with the relevant owners of that. It could be, generally it's an IT organization of some kind that owns the systems, but it could also sometimes be partnering with a vendor who actually owns the software stack inside those systems, right? And so I think the key to unlocking scaling learning is thinking about, again, learning happens in training, But a lot of times learning happens outside of training. And sometimes even learning happens in spite of training. Like we don't always do a great job when we train.
Mhm.
And so what you really have to think about is using every possible moment in someone's working life to inject learning into that. And a lot of times they may not even realize that they're taking training. And it may be us seeing a signal in data that in the manufacturing process, they're causing some defects, right? And so instead of waiting for a million widgets to get built, can we see a signal of that in the first 100 or so and ask that individual to take a pause and say, hey, there's a 5-minute refresher on how to do this thing, retrain them in the moment, and then continue monitoring. And hopefully they've corrected that issue. And if they continue having an issue, that's when maybe we send a signal to someone to go down to the floor and say, hey, David, Frank is having an issue building this widget in this part. Can you, and they've already done the retraining. Can you help see what Frank is doing? And it may be a knowledge issue, maybe an environmental issue, maybe a will issue. Maybe I just had a really bad day because my cat is sick or something like that, right? So those are the things that I think about from a technology perspective. It's not just the traditional systems, but what systems can I take advantage of that are embedded in the work itself that I can deliver learning through?
And are there specific things that, and you've done this in a number of different organizations of different types. Are there spaces that organizations stumble in building their infrastructure to support the consistency and relevance that you've been talking about?
Gosh, I mean, the hardest part is, I mean, you always think about costs, right? So we
Hmm.
think about the dollars and cents of it all. So sometimes organizations stumble because they just aren't able to get the dollars secured to do what they need to do. But setting that aside from it, I think the bigger opportunity lost is actually really around integration with the right systems and getting the right data. I'm actually thinking about the organization I'm part of right now bought a new learning experience platform. They paid all the enterprise license they needed for 100,000 people and then realized it would cost probably 10 to 20% more to do the integration with the HR systems and then all the other, downstream systems. And so that's a huge opportunity loss. So like sort of think ahead about sort of the broader ecosystem of it all in terms of planning and executing against that. I think the other space, and this is a little less about where organizations have stumbled, but maybe I kind of foresee organizations should be spending time thinking about, but I'm not sure if we are, is I think we're really entering this really disruptive phase, David, with AI, and how does AI either augment or potentially replace some of our legacy, learning management, learning record stores, data visualization. I talked about workflow learning. Like I've done a version of performance workflow learning, as you know, for 25 years. And I look back at what I did during my early life in manufacturing, and I think about what you could do now, and it's like I'm a little embarrassed, right? Like to be able to consume large bodies of content and synthesize that quickly within seconds at the moment of need, like that's just really incredible. So less of a historical stumbling block, but I think if learning leaders aren't thinking today about how they could transform the learning experience and therefore the employee experience, therefore the organizational performance, they're really doing disservice to their function. And I mean, the next, I think, 3 to 5 years are going to be heavily disruptive in this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting you touch on that because what I'd like to get your thoughts on, I feel like a lot of the stuff in industry conversations that have been going on in recent years as is kind of have similar themes to what it's always been, but now it's got the coda at the end of every sentence of "and do it faster."
Mm.
That there's this element of speed that is now a large factor in every L&D initiative of we've got to deliver things faster. Some of the trends that you were talking about are reflective of that. So how do you balance the need to accommodate the speed of business and the speed of delivery with the quality that scaling efforts generally have a focus on? How do you balance those two worlds of we need to scale, which sounds like something that would generally take some time to do properly, with the needs of the speed of the business?
Yeah, and if it's okay, I'll add another couple complexities that I often do. It's can you deliver what you've done historically faster? Right. And then every operator I've ever talked to in my career, save two, said yes. Like, please give me my people faster. Like, please give me my contact center agents faster so they could start servicing customers. Please give me my sales folks faster so they can actually engage with customers and sell. I've only actually had two leaders push back over the years about quality at the same time. And it's like, yes, can you deliver faster, but also maintain the same bar in terms of quality or even higher, right? And that's, I think, sometimes a struggle where we go fast and we cut corners. Especially we may give the business someone who they don't feel is ready. And you may have folks in the business who think of it from a legacy perspective, like my people used to be this good and I still need them to get good in less amount of time. But really for the business, do you really need that bar or can it be lower? So I think that's another layer of complexity I would add to that, David, which is speed and quality. The other thing that learning leaders are getting asked to do a lot now as well is, deliver faster, maybe at the same quality or not, with the same amount of resources or less. And that's been a trend I've seen since probably 2000. I think we all got really stretched because, during COVID, we're all sitting at home and trying to find ways to deliver to either new hires or existing hires in a different configuration and, with hybrid and virtual at the time. And I think a lot of those practices have stuck. I think a lot of organizations were able to move forward in their digital efforts, but then now organizations are kind of pulling back where like, now that we can go back to in person, can we do some of that? But the resources haven't necessarily come back in that same amount of proportion. So I don't know if I have any great answers, David. It's definitely as a learning leader, it's like do more, same amount of resources, and sometimes do it faster with higher quality or the same quality. There's a reason why I have more gray hair today than I did 5 to 7 years ago, I would say.
Don't we all? That's true. Well, we're going to take one more break. And when we come back, we're going to look at we're going to close our conversation with thoughts on how we measure the impact and sustain scalability with one of these programs. So stay with us.
A virtual session can go wrong in seconds. Tech issues, awkward silences, distracted learners, it all adds up to a training disaster. But at InSync Training, our expert virtual producers don't just keep things running, they elevate your sessions. We handle the tech, troubleshoot issues, and keep things on track. We support facilitators so they can focus on delivering great content. We manage breakout rooms, live polls, and interactions seamlessly. If training is critical to your business, production should be too. So let's talk. Schedule a free consultation today.
All right, welcome back. So we're going to shift and close our conversation with a focus on measuring impact and sustaining scalability after a program has been launched. So Frank, you've got a program, you've scaled it. How do you ensure that it's actually improving performance and you're maintaining that quality and engagement that you set before you scaled?
Yeah, what I would say, David, is I'll have to thank and apologize first of all to Donald Kirkpatrick, right? So most of us in this industry think about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, right? Level
Mm-hmm.
1, attitude, level 4, ROI. It's a really interesting framework. I think in a lot of ways it does a great service for our industry. In other ways, it distracts us from the things that I think the business actually cares about the most, right? So I'll be pretty honest that I do measure some of Kirkpatrick's levels, but really more what I go focus on are both. I think we categorize in a few different ways, David. I think about learning operating metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about learning operating metrics as sort of like the dashboard in your car. You've got your speedometer, you got your tachometer, you've got different lights that may pop on and off. And so I track with any given organization 40 to 50 learning metrics every month and every quarter. And I look for trends across those so that I can see if there's a warning light on the dashboard about, there's a problem in this part of the organization. Like one organization I inherited had 12,000 learning assets they built over 18 years. A pretty significant body of content. My hypothesis at the time was half that content was probably orphaned and not relevant. Like somebody
Mm-hmm.
built it and then they're no longer with the company and shouldn't be there. So after a big cleanup activity, it turns out we actually really had a footprint of about 2,300 that was correct and active. So you can imagine 10,000 were not.
Yeah.
So one that presents problems with learners trying to find anything. That's actually probably the most benign problem. The bigger problem is a lot of organizations that are regulated. If you end up being audited, let's say by an FDA or by OSHA or FDIC, they will look at that and say, hey, you made content available to your employees that was not correct. And so it actually becomes a deeper regulatory issue, right? So for certain organizations, those types of operating metrics are really key for you to measure the health of your learning as its own function. So that's kind of its one set of metrics. The other set of metrics I generally try to look for is on the opposite extreme are outcome metrics. And really I look for business outcome metrics, right? I think the holy grail of any learning function is try to figure out how do I connect those learning metrics to those business metrics. And I've done that in every organization I've been in to some varying degree of success. I'm going to go back to kind of one of my earlier examples with a retailer. We were able to do statistical correlations of learning and skill campaigns. So, for instance, leading into the holiday season, we would upskill the workforce on the products that we would be selling in Black Friday, to be pretty blunt about it. And then we would measure the sales variance against that. And what you end up naturally seeing are people who opt in the training and people who don't. And that happens in every organization. So as a learning function, rather than fighting that, you can actually take advantage of that. Because what you end up doing is having a natural A and B group. A group upskilled, B group did not. And then you could look at the sales revenue against those two A and B groups. And so we got actually quite masterful at this at every product group that we had. And in general, what I would say is you can actually watch the variance of sales revenue, and you saw the almost exactly the same variance for the people who upskilled against the people who did not. It was really, really clear cut. So those are the kind of ways to think about those outcome metrics is, what actually matters to the business. Most businesses think about sales revenue. Some of them, instead of top line revenue, may think about margin. But there are a lot of other metrics too that business units care about. Manufacturing organizations generally care about defects per million. Contact centers generally think about average handling time or first contact resolution. If you think about other operational organizations, they have their own metrics that are, based on operations. So if you really sit back and think about whatever business or function you're in, there are probably some key business metrics that they could be revenue related, they could be margin related, but they're obviously generally operationally related. So then the key is figuring out how do I bridge the gap from those learning operating metrics to the business metrics. And sometimes you can figure that out.
Yes.
Other times you can't. And so that leads me to sort of the third version, which as sometimes the outcome metric has an input metric or a leading indicator of some kind, right? So can you measure those leading indicators and then drive that correlation? And so that's, for me, it generally ends up being about 50-50, where I can take a learning operating metric and correlate it to a business outcome metric, but sometimes it ends up being some leading indicator that the business will believe in. And if you don't have that, quite honestly, this is where I think 20 years now into my career, data science I've seen grown tremendously. And so if you can hire someone who can just go focus on this on a daily basis, is what data can you get access to from a business outcome perspective, or what metrics can you engineer that's an input to those outcome metrics, and then figure out how to build your correlation against the two. If you can do that, all you're going to do is talk to the business about what matters to them, and if they never even know about Kirkpatrick nor your learning outcome metrics, great. You've actually won, because they honestly don't care about, did you get a 4.85 on your survey at the last workshop? They really just don't care. But they do care if you help them mitigate concessions on revenue because of rebates and discounts. They care about that tremendously.
So as I think about everything we've talked about, and especially where we landed with measurement, a lot of the figures that you'd be tracking, a lot of the metrics around that you're correlating the impact to, they're not just driven by the value of the learning professional. They're driven by the people throughout the organization who are performing this. And I think about some of the advice you've shared around scalability. A lot of it is going to be the success and failure in many ways is in the hands of the people in the field, the managers and the leaders. So how do you engage? What role does leadership, sponsorship, and management support play in your scaling initiatives, and how do you build that into your strategy?
Yeah, super awesome question, David. Every organization is a little bit different. I think in my early days, I thought of learning as just tops down, right? Where like, hey, we're moving from brick and mortar business to e-business. That was the early part of my life and career. And so we had the VP for e-business just kind of dropped a hammer on people, said, hey, you need to take this SAP basics training because it's online now and not in person. I think the next phase of my life, I realized that it was tops down, bottoms up. meaning you had to engage senior leaders to share a message. You had to make the front line aware and also have desire to build that. I mean, if you can do that, you kind of meet in the middle. The larger organizations, that's generally not sufficient. Just because a CEO or vice president or whoever said do it, and then you convince the front line they should do it, that doesn't always get you there. Most larger organizations, which I would put a number at about 200,000, you generally have to engage the middle. And then to your point, leverage sort of middle managers and frontline managers to also drive the top line, tops down messaging, and then you finally connect with the front line. So to use a real example of that, recently we rolled out an AI initiative for all 100,000 people. I sort of looked at the objectives and the overall strategic plan, and I said, we could roll this out like you normally would roll out a compliance training course. The problem is you would train people on AI and they would promptly forget it, and it would lead to no actual behavior, which the desired outcome was getting everybody, one, aware and excited about using AI tools, understanding how to apply them in their work. And so I said, well, I actually think we should pivot on the rollout plan and do e-learning as digital learning as a way to build foundational knowledge. But if you really want to drive behavior change, it comes down to the frontline manager. And so we actually gave every frontline manager 3 sets of about 15, 20-minute learning products. And we asked them to find 15, 20 minutes in upcoming staff meetings and deliver it to their teams. And so thousands of managers have now done this over the last few weeks. And interestingly, this is actually coming as a surprise to me, Dave, as you look at the numbers, the pace of those sort of team meeting workshops driven by managers is outpacing the digital learning. I would have actually predicted the other way around, but when you look at the numbers, like they're actually leading. And so while I had a few managers push back on me early on, most of them have come back and said, well, it was a lot of fun. Like I got my team engaged. They were able to help me, one, contextualize how to use AI in the work. Two, they served as role models to their teams that they had to upskill themselves to actually engage in the conversation. But three, now it'll become part of, quite honestly, the performance management process. Like, hey, let's say, David, I worked for you and you did a session for me and the rest of my colleagues about how to use Gemini to do a panel of experts when you're doing a market analysis. Like, okay, now one, I know you know how to do it. Two, you set the bar and served as a role model to do it. And now three, you can see how I'm applying it in my work and coach me. And then at the end of the year, four, it could and should be part of the performance management conversation. To what extent did I actually apply what you helped me to learn, right? So it's a really, I think, a tactical way of thinking about how do you leverage your leadership ranks to activate and also to drive behavior change. It's more than just sending them a report of how their team is doing against compliance training completion, right? It's really actively engaging them in a learning product model.
Yeah. So as we wrap our time here, there's obviously a lot involved in scaling effectively, and you shared a lot of great tips on how to do this effectively in different types of organizations. I think there are probably some listeners to the podcast who haven't had to do this before, and everything that we've discussed so far can feel overwhelming if you've never had to operate in this space. So what's one piece of advice that you would give to someone, an L&D leader, who's going to need to significantly scale efforts in the next year for the first time?
Yeah, I'll steal an analogy from actually one of my former leaders. At first, when Eric said this, I didn't get it. And as the years went on, it made more sense. And then basically what he said to me is, sometimes it's easier to steer a moving truck than a parked truck. And so sometimes, we look at something and say, gosh, that it's so intimidating to figure out how do I scale to 100,000 or a million people. It's so intimidating to figure out how do I do, a digital strategy for my organization. That's okay. It's not going to get any better by analyzing it. It will seem less daunting as you just start moving towards it and be okay with the fact that the fastest path from A to Z may not be a straight line. And I think it's really key and people talk about experimentation and failing fast. I'm trying to avoid those words. It's actually more about setting yourself a direction and getting some forward movement, and then evaluating along the way whether that direction makes sense and being okay with course corrections to get there. So anyway, I've taken that advice over the years of just say, hey, sometimes sitting still and waiting for the best answer to come to you actually isn't the best approach to making that problem any simpler than it is.
It's a great piece of advice for us to close the discussion on. I really thank you for what has been a really thoughtful discussion. We could have gone into deeper, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And you reminded me that it's one thing to scale content. It's another thing to scale experiences that matter. And I think that you've given us some great examples as to why the strategy and the systems and the impact all need to align in order for us to really be scaling our programs effectively. So I want to thank you for everything you shared with us here on the podcast today.
Thank you, David, for the time. It's good to see you again.
You as well. And to our listeners, if you want to take a deeper dive into this and other critical L&D topics, be sure to visit insynctraining.com/webinar, where you'll be able to register for our upcoming webinar that extends the themes of this podcast, as well as check out recordings from other insightful discussions unpacking today's critical L&D challenges. Spots for the upcoming webinar are limited, so reserve yours today at insynctraining.com/webinar. And to stay in the loop on the latest trends in learning and development, be sure to subscribe to Modern Learning on the Air to be the first to know when new episodes go live. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.